Okay, we ready? I see some far more experienced faces in this room than me, so beginner 101 on web apps isn't really... but I guess you didn't fancy the texting coding session. What I'm going to talk about is a Xojo Web app, one in particular that I developed, probably the first web app I did. So there's going to be plenty of mistakes in here that you can pick on, because I intend to learn as much from you as I may impart to yourselves. But let's talk a little bit about me first. Who am I? Who am I to dare come here and talk about Xojo? Self-taught. My day job for 30 years was a police officer. Programming was an aside for me. Although in the early 90s I did get roped in to write the first ever crime management system for our police force. We only used paper up to that point. They just discovered computers, but they had nobody who could program them. So that was my first large-scale network system. That was back in 1992. Visual Basic I was using around about that time and later, and then I discovered Xojo in about 2010. I maintain a number of systems, but probably like many of you, I don't make a living out of Xojo. I make enough to come and visit XDC most years, which works for me. But I program mainly for pleasure, which seems a bit of a strange thing to do. In fact, I think my wife thinks I'm some sort of masochist programming of an evening to relax, but there we go. I'm sure that many of you started in a similar way and get a lot out of programming in exactly the same way as I do, by creating something that you and others might find useful. This particular app I'm going to talk about was developed over a number of years, but I'd better tell you first what it actually does and a little bit about the reason for bringing it about. Unlike most countries, UK police officers don't have a union. They're not entitled to strike. In fact, if they go on strike or withdraw their labour or work to rule, it's an offence called disaffection, for which they could be imprisoned. Nice, isn't it? Oops. Get the work of this death by PowerPoint at some point. But the representatives, they've all got a day job. You have to be a police officer to be a federation representative. They act like a union rep in as much as they'll look after you if you come into contact with any conduct issues, equality issues, and a whole plethora of other issues that you might have an issue with. But their main role is police officers 24/7, and they do this as an aside over and above their day job. There was little emphasis on recognition, and it's important that we recognise these people for the work that they do. So ultimately, back in 2012, I was elected as the secretary of our local branch, so I was responsible for the 3,000 police officers in our force, ably assisted by 3 colleagues. And what became very clear to me is we had a group of 30 trained representatives who were there to look after our 3,000 officers. Some of them wouldn't do anything or weren't doing anything. Others were working too hard and probably, affecting their health. So I thought it would probably be nice to have a system where we could record that the work that they were doing, not only for their benefit, but to make sure they were doing what they should be doing and, from my point of view, to make sure that they weren't overstretching themselves. So the problem was, as I'm sure this won't come as a surprise to anybody, there's no accurate mechanism for recording any work. Paper records, cumbersome, everyone did them a different way, people didn't submit them. It was too much trouble, for want of a better description, especially when your day job was going out and catching criminals. Not everyone completed the worksheets. There was poor accuracy and consistency, and ultimately it was time consuming. And there's one thing you probably learn about police officers: many aren't very patient. And we had no way of really analysing the work that they were doing, which was a bit of a problem for me because I was responsible for them. So back in 2012, because I was way ahead of the curve, I wrote the system in PHP and MySQL. And that's what it looked like. I'm not going to win any design awards. I probably ain't going to win any design awards for the Xojo version you'll see in a minute. But that's ugly, probably because of my PHP and CSS skills. They're not up there with the likes of some of the work I see, from others in this room. The other thing I found, it was very difficult to use on a phone and a tablet. And by this time, most people were accessing the internet on a phone and a tablet. They weren't using, PCs. And, the touch capability and the jQuery calendar, for example, which is what I was using in the date field, really didn't work particularly well on a phone. So along comes the Xojo version. And spookily looks rather similar, but it's easier to use on a phone. And what I've tended to do is go for the lowest common denominator. So start with the phone, and then tablet, and this works on both phone and tablet. And all our offices are provided with work phones, job phones. In fact, they're all provided with their own laptop nowadays. Yeah, the UK really is that far behind the US in relation to supporting police officers for technology. But mobile working is what everyone talks about nowadays. So they're provided with this kit in order to carry out their job. Some of the benefits of doing it in Xojo, there's an inbuilt help system, which I'm going to talk about later. I told you, this is Web 101, so if you think you're in the wrong room. Drop-down menus for the dates, which work better. Better error checking on form submission. All of these things I could have done in PHP, but I really didn't want to. And then what I've also done is, because a new performance regime came in about 2016, other than my force, other forces use this now, so I had to make it more scalable than it actually was. Why did I choose Xojo Web? And I have spoken to people who've not used Xojo Web at all, but it's slowly becoming my favourite platform out of all of them, to be perfectly honest. If you've used it before, you already know the answer. I hadn't, and I wondered why it was ever introduced when I first saw it. I thought, well, who's going to use web? I mean, what's the point of having web apps? But actually, since doing this and a number of other web apps, I've actually come to really like it, and it's probably becoming my de facto platform in all honesty. There is the one negative, hosting. You can host yourself, and it's quite interesting, having spoken to people over the last couple of days, the different hosting solutions they've come up with. I'll talk about what I use in a moment. But when I started working in web, I found the book that Eugene Dakin did, I Wish I Knew Xojo Web. And that was my start of a 10, set up my own web server and just basically learned it from the ground up. There's a couple of extra steps with web. Predominantly, you can see that I'm using Windows. I'm a Windows user. I do have a Mac. I rather jokingly say that I do tend to spend most of my time on it, updating it, and not doing a lot else with it. I do spend all my time really in Windows. So there's some extra software that I'm going to talk about on Windows that you'll need to get your great app up into the cloud. That might not be applicable to Mac users, but I'm not sufficient Mac savvy to be able to comment on that one way or the other, so hopefully somebody in the room can. Make a decision about the sort of app you want. You don't just produce an executable or an image now, you want a standalone or a CGI. I personally use CGI currently, but ultimately, as a result of Greg's talk yesterday and the fact that the Web 2 framework is going to move towards standalone apps, I'm clearly going to have to rethink that strategy. I'm using Linux on server warp servers. Philip Zadalis, he's an active member of the community, and I find the service good. It works, does exactly what it says on the tin, and is reliable. You need to get the files off your own machine onto your server. Clearly, if you're using Xojo Cloud, there's a nice little push button, and it's all done for you in the background within Xojo, but you need just a couple of bits of additional software. And the one thing that did confuse me at the bottom, the file and directory permissions, but thankfully with a bit of help and support from the community and Philip, you soon get to grips with what you need to do to protect your files, but also make them executable from the web. And that WinSCP is the piece of software I use to upload the files, change the file permissions, and so on and so forth. And you've got to bear in mind that web apps behave differently to desktop apps. It takes a little bit of getting used to at first because things don't always happen in the order that you want them to. And there's also that delay between the server and your app. Thankfully, it doesn't seem to be much of an issue with this app because it is so basic and there's such a little data exchange that the lag really isn't noticeable. I'll just go back to that one. The other one thing to bear in mind, and I didn't realize it, in CGI apps, they auto-quit if there's no sessions. In the executable apps, the standalone executables, it's the other way around. And I couldn't work out why my CGI app every other week, I'd have to reboot it and restart it until I discovered that if I put auto-quit in there equals false, it actually keeps on running. And ever since then, it's been rock solid. Certainly that's my experience. If I'm wrong on that, then please, somebody correct me. So what have we got? Probably the simplest database you're ever going to see. We've got the main database which stores the records and records the time, and then we've got a little lookup database so that when people log into this system, we know where they're coming from. It is very, very simple. 2 databases linked by the ID of the force ID, and that's it in a nutshell. So the main database stores the records that come in, provided somebody's got a valid login. The RepTime app does all the work, and it links to a desktop app that the members run in their own office to produce their charts and so on and so forth, which I'll talk about in a minute. The one thing that really attracted me to Xojo as well, when I first looked at it back in 2010, was the way it integrated with Microsoft Office. The organization this is for just love Microsoft Office. They've been using an Access database for the membership database since 1998. And it still works. There's one thing you can say about Microsoft. You know, a legacy application that's almost, over 20 years old still runs today like it did then. It's not to be sniffed at because I see the frustration, certainly, of people in the Mac community that every week, you know, Apple have suddenly decided you need to do something this way, and then you spend a lot of time having to rewrite your apps. So to get things working 20 years later that were written 20 years ago is no mean feat, but it just does it. So, if you're new to web apps, what's the benefit? Well, it's there all the time. It's always accessible, and it's cross-platform. You don't have to build for different targets. You know, you build your one executable app, you upload it into the cloud, and then whatever device anybody wants to connect from, it's available. This app's particularly easy to use, quick data entry, gives us better data consistency. And unfortunately, again, going back to my PHP skills, which were basically non-existent other than the fact it had a script to insert records into a MySQL database, every time a new branch came online, I would have a different script and a slightly different login and so on and so forth. And maintaining multiple scripts became a bit of a pain, to be quite frank. Cumbersome to maintain, certainly as more and more branches came online. Now with the web app, that became a lot easier because I could have the one app and then suddenly work out, using the session URL parameters and count, you know, who was logging in, where they were from, where their records should be stored, and so on and so forth. So this is where we might get a bit of debate. How do I identify different users and get them into the system? Because I'll tell you one thing, police officers don't like logins and logging in and remembering passwords and so on and so forth. They just want to arrive at a page and enter a record. So I use a dynamic DNS service. Now, it was interesting again to listen to Greg yesterday, because clearly with the new Xojo Cloud, that's something you're going to get. You're going to be able to point a domain name to a specific web application. This is in fact what DDNS does. Rather than giving them some convoluted IP address to server warp and some directory paths to go into, they get their unique DDNS record and it goes straight to their particular login. Give them an access code, because the one thing you will discover with police officers, they do like to fiddle and try and break things. So at the moment, I just give them a 10-digit code, which is unique to their branch. So on the basis that, well, they probably won't remember 10 digits and their code number and so on and so forth. And they don't tend to talk to each other between different forces anyway, to a great extent, which has been a source of frustration for the UK government for many years, actually. But the DDNS service works really, really well. The service I use is a company called noip.com. Excellent value for money, $25 a year for 25 host names, $30 a year for 50 host names. So what I only give to each branch is their DDNS login, and I'll give you one to try in a moment, at which point you'll no doubt break the app completely. Checks their validity, checks their settings, because each branch can have some particular settings, which I'll touch on in a moment. And very, very simple. Can you read that? Let's see if I can do this. Oops. So when they log in, checks if there's some parameters along with their login. Somebody's ringing. Checks whether the key is valid. There's also an admin login, which I'll talk about later. That was only recently introduced. In fact, the frustration I found with this was when Xojo said, yeah, come along and do a beginner's 101 on web, every time I went into the app, I thought, well, I can't show them that code and how I used to do it, so I'd have to rewrite it. But then I got to a point where I thought, well, I'm not rewriting it anymore. You can have the warts and all version, and then we'll see, whether I've improved on that since. But it just looks for a code. It looks for a valid access. If it gets it, then it lets them in. If it doesn't, it says, well, they're unregistered, so show them the page, but don't let them do anything interesting. I'm going to switch into Xojo. Don't worry, I'll zoom in on this one as well. Is that readable, or shall I go bigger again? So they arrive at the page, we do a little query, we decide, I use limit 1, but there's only going to be one record in there, maybe that's a bad habit. Clearly, if you're going to get multiple hits, then in MySQL, limit 1 just gives you the first one you come across, so I still keep that in there. If we get a nil record set, then don't do very much, other than check to see whether I've marked that force to be offline. It might well be that they haven't paid their bill, so they haven't got any access. If I've not set a particular message and they're offline, then we just display a default message, and so on. Then we come down. We check, there's an expenses module built into this. We don't use it at the moment, it's purely for recording time. If they want their expenses button turned on for effect so they can record their expenses, their traveling and their mileage, then within the lookup database there's a Boolean field to just say yes or no. This is a hangover from the legacy. I didn't encrypt any of the notes that were put in the database, and then I came to the conclusion that, well, if I can read it, anybody can read it. So I decided to add encryption, but we were in a halfway house because a number of forces were using this and they still had records that they hadn't imported into their main research tool, if you like. So I had to give them the option to stay unencrypted, and then as they've removed their records, then they've all become encrypted. So that's a hangover from the past. And I use the MBS plugins in relation to that. Storing all this in the session variables. I don't fully understand sessions, I'm not going to lie to you. I just use them basically for storing the content of variables unique to each individual that logs on. Also record details in the lookup database of how many times their system's been used, when was the last time it was used, and so on and so forth. And the error check-in is at the most basic level, in all honesty. I do need to improve that. In fact, this has been improved because it now stores a log on the server rather than just displaying a message that the person on the other side isn't going to recognize. So come out of that. And once they've given the valid key and the lookup, we load their full name and do the changes that I just mentioned to you. And then we continue. So what's the main page look like? You've seen it before. Simple and functional. I'm a great believer in keeping things simple. KISS is the anagram that we use. Keep it simple, stupid. I made it look like a phone, but it's not a phone app, it's a web app.
Right. But if I run this on my desktop, it will look like that.
No, it'll look like whatever your browser look like. Yeah. Yeah. I've done nothing more than, because this is predominantly used on phones and tablets, it does basic control lock into the left, it expands the note field as you might do, but nothing else moves. Yeah. 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 Another app I do, for example, does work slightly differently. We'll have a different page for a wider device and a shorter page for a smaller, but this was specifically designed for phones. So if you open it in a 1024 web browser, you'll have 1024, 768, or whatever resolution. So it'll just look like a stretched version of what you see on the screen. It is minimalist, but we only need to record very, very basic information. It's effective, it loads quickly, and it only uses the basic Xojo controls, and I think I'm a great believer in less is sometimes more. There is a link there, that will work, so I've set up a DDNS to that, so if you want to try that web address, which is xdev2019.ddns.net, then you'll see it on your own device. I'll leave that up there for a few moments. This is where you all crash it and put me to shame. Hold on. And you see on your Mac it's stretched, yeah. So, the old system didn't have any help built into it. Again, I could have added some relatively easily, but jumping between pages, PHP, HTML, and so on and so forth, didn't want to do that. So I didn't add any help until this. So if you want to look at the help, you just press the question mark on the top, which is just an image view that loads up a built-in HTML file. Simplistically achieved, in all honesty, but very, very easy to implement. And easy to update. So you only got to update one page. If the help changes, you haven't got to do very much else. How do we create the help? Well, none of this is going to come as any surprise. So the mouse down event I could have used the mouse up event in just the same way. There's a folder item. If we're in the debug build, look in a different place for the help file. Load it as a text input. Read it all, and then load the page in a HTML viewer. The HTML viewer, I store off the page and make it invisible, and then we just, depending on whether we're showing or hiding it, move it in a different direction, unhide it or show it. And that's what it looks like in Xojo. You can see on that one, it's got the expenses button on the page as well. So in the IDE, that's the main page on the left-hand side, and the HTML viewer, because I just prefer to have her off screen, because you know when you're designing interfaces, the last thing you want is loads of stack controls, because it's a real pain finding the ones hidden behind others, so I just move them and slide them around as required. Seems to work fine. Doesn't seem to be any performance hit. So what do we do? Well, it's all about submitting data, to be brutally honest. All things I didn't do in the PHP version, now so easy within Xojo. You know, you all do error checking in your own apps. Now we can do them in the web apps in exactly the same way. Once you've checked that all the data is present, I'm using the MBS plugin to encrypt the data using a salt and another unique force thing. So in effect, it's not one salt for every different organization. There's a salt and then there's another couple of bits of information, so that if somebody inadvertently got hold of somebody else's data and put it into their desktop app, then they wouldn't be able to read it because they would have a different salt. It's very, very basic. Prepared statements, gotta love them. I didn't particularly like them at first, but actually the more I've used them, obviously it's good practice. the more I like them, and I'll talk about them in a few moments. So we insert the data, reset the form values, and then you can go round and round in a circle until you want to close the application. Prepared statements. I won't go on to that one just yet. Let's just go back into Xojo. It's here somewhere. So let's have a look at the entry validation. Nothing complicated in this whatsoever. Other than my server seems to insist on US dates, so I've got to do a little bit of fiddling around to work with the UK. This is only in use in the UK, and I suppose I'm really lucky because I don't have to globalize the apps I'm writing. I haven't got to worry too much about the format, so I can be really clunky and just do it, in a rather roundabout way. But we get the date. And I build it. So the date entered is just a load of strings concatenated together in the order that I want them. I do pass the date to obviously just check that it is a valid one. If it's not, then display that it's an invalid date. So we check that all the fields are filled in. Just a load of if-then statements. And put them back in the right place. There is a timer on the page which just displays or flashes up a message at the bottom, either in red or green, saying whether it's been good or bad. And then eventually, once we're happy that everything's in there, we go off and insert the record. So, double click on that. So, inserting a record. There's the bit for the MBS, which I added about for encrypting the data. We encode it, which is what Kem's talking about next door. Always using UTF-8 myself. Blowfish encryption seemed to be what people were recommending. I don't understand it, I'll be totally honest with you, but it does turn what they type in into the notes into total gibberish, so that seems to work for me. The prepared statements, they were a bit of a faff the first time I used them, but actually, when you actually look at them, they make perfect sense. So we're inserting into the database the different fields, and then as we come over here, there's a load of question marks for the values. So, all looks good so far. And then what we have is a different line, as you'll see, where we bind to a particular field type. So there's a question mark at point 0 within the prepared statement, and then we bind the different types of data that we're going to get to each of those question marks. And then I've got two, depending on whether they're being encrypted or not, two different ways of building it. We then execute it. So inserting a date there, what's in the pop-up for the type of inquiry, what's in the collar number, and so on and so forth. And the rest of the data just pops in there. Now the only frustration with prepared statements, to me, unless somebody can tell me different, is that you can't see what the statement looks like before you insert it in the database. Whereas before, when we were all building it with, SQL equals select from, data type, table, field, etc., you could just look at the SQL variable and say, oh yeah, this is what it looks like, and you can find your mistakes. When you're building them in this way, you can't see the contents, and I just find that sometimes difficult to just track down where the error is in your statements. But I've made the change, suffered the pain along the way, and it is really good and obviously protects against one of the biggies of using online web database, which is SQL injection. And for those in the room that don't know this, apologies if I'm teaching you to suck eggs, it's one of the most common web hacking techniques to damage databases, for want of a better description. Now, the other advantages I was able to add with going for Xojo that I certainly didn't have when we were talking in PHP was the fact that when these apps, just go through that one. When these apps are running, you can have as many timers as you like running within the apps doing different things. So I thought it'd be really good to use a couple of timers. Now, the shutdown timer, CGI web apps are running all the time. So if you build a CGI app and then you go and upload it onto your server, the old one's still running. It's very difficult, certainly in my provider, to shut the app down and then restart it. So by popping a timer in there that checks every 5 seconds for this particular file, the .cgi file, if the file exists, it keeps on running. If the file's missing, so in effect, you log in using your file manager and you delete that file, the app shuts down, you upload the new one, automatically starts running again, and away you go. It's so easy. And the other beauty, of course, with web apps is as soon as you make a change to your app, everyone gets that change straight away. No sending out executables or no worrying about sending them a CD if people still do that. So we delete the CGI, the app stops, upload the new version. The other thing was quite useful is that the system's in use most days, storing records, but it'd be really useful to tell the office, hang on, you've got some records that you need to import into your local database, pop online, grab them, and download them. So every 24 hours, we send an email notification. Now that was fun and games because I got my maths wrong when I first did this. So if I go into auto timers, which I can see there, we have a look at that. There's a couple of setup things. I'll talk about MBS chart director in a minute because I do use that system now. So there's the two timers set up with their own ad handlers. But what I actually did, I got this wrong when I first did the 24-hour one because I forgot that there's 1,000 milliseconds in a second. So when I did the maths and put 3,600,000 is an hour, it should have been 86,400,000. So when I came in on the Monday and I got loads of phone calls saying I've had 72 emails over the weekend telling me I got 5, I thought, what have I done wrong here? And of course, it was the fact that I forgot to account for the fact there's 1,000 milliseconds in a second. So don't do that. It was a surefire way of annoying your users. It's really difficult juggling this when it's so big on the screen. The email notification, again, you won't be surprised to see. It's relatively straightforward code. If there are any beginners in the audience that want this afterwards, I'll make it available to Dana. There's nothing in there that is a national secret. So every 24 hours, we do a connect to the database, set up a mail socket, search through the records, finding any records that may or may not exist. And then we send out an email, relatively straightforward, with the obligatory don't reply to this email message at the bottom, because you don't want lots of people telling you they've received the message or replying to it, especially when there's a lot of them. Build it up, send it, and away it goes. And then 24 hours time, it comes back and does exactly the same thing. Just to remind the people in the office that during the previous day they've had X number of new entries in their database. So they connect to the online database, they then download the messages, and then it's fine. If there's no messages in there to be downloaded, then it doesn't send them an email. And I must remember to repeat the question next time. Otherwise I'll be struck off the register. Okay, so we end up, I really like web. I've moved to it hook, line, and sinker in many respects, but this app also has a desktop component. It's written in Microsoft Windows because some of the technologies I use are Microsoft Windows based. I use Microsoft Office. I see no swearing and cursing in the room, so I got away with that one. I use it for the graphing capability and the ability to export and analyze the data. It also connects using the ODBC to the legacy 20-year-old Microsoft Access database to import the notes that anybody might have added. The Xojo Office plugin for me is probably one of its most useful features in the grand scheme of things, and I use it an awful lot in a lot of my applications. But of course, you do need to be on Windows and running Microsoft Office, which is a downside when you're in a room full of predominantly Mac users. I'm not afraid to use plugins. Got the Einhugger date control there, written by Bjorn Eriksson. Well maintained, fantastic set of plugins if anybody's ever come across them. I'll talk about the drop-down for the period box in a moment, because that was a user feature. And the great thing about developing software, isn't it, is a user comes to you and wants a feature, and you think, well, that's not going to be too much work. You develop it for them and give it to them, and they think they're the best thing since sliced bread, don't they? The only trouble is, of course, they keep coming back for more then. And you can see at the bottom, I deliberately didn't provide the correct seed code, if you like, to get the data back, and all you've got on the bottom for the notes is a squiggle of gibberish. Now the search period drop-down, great thing to implement. Although I got the date control in there and they can pick between specific dates, they came to me and said, well, wouldn't it be really useful if we did a specific period? So I gave them a set of, the common periods, if you like. So the current month, previous year. Now all this SQL is done in the concatenation mode, not a prepared statement, because it's hidden under the bonnet and nobody can add anything to it, and the year and so on. And it basically adds those different periods. Now it's going to be different for different flavors of SQL, but I'm sure you could get the equivalent for the database system that you're using relatively easy. So now what they do is they tend to compare regular periods against regular periods. So they just look at the last month, the last 3 months, the last 12 months, the previous year, and compare and so on and so forth. I template all the graphs that they've got access to. I pre-build them in Excel, and then all Xojo does is comes along and fills in the gaps. You can set the graphs up in advance, and the automation plugin takes care of everything in relation to that and referred to as needed. And all you've got to do is save these files alongside your executable. Xojo picks them up, generates the file, and displays it in your chosen application. And it saves you an awful lot of programming work, because you haven't got to worry about, well, how do I print it? Because they can go into Excel and do file print. How can I modify it? Well, they can edit it directly because they've used a template, it's created a file for them, and they can mess about with it to their heart's content. So you haven't got to worry about doing print preview views in your own system and so on and so forth. Just use everything they've already got installed. If they haven't got it installed, they're in trouble. So we've got some examples of the graphs we do, and they'll become a bit larger in a moment. Top left is the top 20 reps, so they are sort of compared against each other. The next one was a little bit tricky, which was the role in previous 12 months, and the bottom one is the different types of work they do and how many minutes they do for each. So you may be able to see those in a little bit more detail. Anybody who's not on the list, so there's only the top 20, and look how low the bottom was. This thing's only about 10 minutes. The other 10 of my reps aren't doing very much at all, so they'll be in the office for a chat, and they won't be getting a donut. The last 12 months, and of course, the different categories of work we do. Now, I come to what I do that's naughty. I connected the database directly from the office. So the database is sitting there in the cloud. The desktop application connects to it. And why do I do it? Well, it's tiny amounts of data we're downloading, so there's no real lag in the amount of time it takes. The data sets are small, the download is quick, and every address is whitelisted, because I can whitelist the addresses that can connect to the database. So every time a new user comes online, I whitelist their address, they can connect. If they're not whitelisted, they can't even connect to the database. So I mitigate any sort of real danger there, as far as I'm aware. What I used to do in the past was ask them to pop along to whatismyip.com, which will give you your IP address. But I found those conversations got particularly difficult And they said, what? And then they would type it into the Google search rather than the bar at the top. And you know the way it goes. You've all done support calls. But the beauty is it was easy to implement, and this application goes back to 2012. I've learned better practice since then, you know, with the advent of things like Allo and Xanadu and so on and so forth. I may well change it to an API in the future, which would be a lot more sensible solution. But at the moment, it works, and touch wood, if this is actually wood, there's been no issues with it. But I thought, well, it would be useful to avoid those difficult conversations about, well, how do I get the IP address? So to the help screen, just add this short bit of code, which is relatively straightforward. All we do is the version of the app that's running. Let's come out of that a little bit. Create a new HTTP socket. Go along to this API address, which is really useful, api.ipify.org. And then what you get returned is the IP address of the machine. So if you want to include that in your own apps, feel free. It's free to use. And where are we now? Well, it's all going to go online now. I've got bored with the desktop. The iNugger plugins allow me to create Excel files on the fly, which can be downloaded. So the new app has got the web analysis side of it built in. This is admin protected using a login page. The login's only given to the managers of each particular office. And as you can see down the right-hand side, we've got what it looks like. So there's all the current reps. It's in a normal list box. Click on the list box, pick a name, or all of them, and then Chart Director pops in a nice little graph of how people are doing. So when somebody's wandering around with their phone or their tablet, they're not in the office, they're at their meeting of all their reps, for example, they can see who the slackers are and have them in for a quick chat. But more importantly, it wasn't about the slackers for me. We've got some of these people who are going way in excess of the time that they should be spending assisting people when you consider they're doing 10 and 12-hour policing shifts during the day as well. For me, it was more about the well-being rather than the fact that the people, you know, you're going to get people who won't do anything anyway. They just turn up for the knife and fork brigade, as we used to call them. They'd come for all the free meals, but they wouldn't do a lot else in between. Really, I haven't got a lot of time for them. It was more about the people who were working really hard on our behalf. I've got a couple of other apps running on different servers. So, for example, I've got a console app that monitors this website, so it tries to load it every 15 minutes, looks for the headers. If it gets a correct hit, then it says, yep, it's fine, everything's good. If it doesn't, then I get a text message to say the server's down, I can log in, reboot it, or whatever I need to do. Also, when somebody wants to become an admin, they send in a page full of information, and then once I authorize it, I've got a desktop app that allows me to authorize that. And that desktop system manager allows me to reset their passwords, email the users, and do various other bits and pieces, making my life easy and disabling their access if indeed they've not actually paid. And that, I think, brings me up to almost my time. So if you've got any questions, answers, or even criticisms, I'm your man. Sorry, Tom. Question is, have we converted the Access database to MySQL? No, because I've got no control over that Access database. It's a legacy database that I have to work around. What I do actually do, however, is, as Carol mentioned yesterday, I use a product called Navicat. It's not cheap. I think the latest version is $1,200 if you want the premium version. I bought the non-commercial license when my work wouldn't pay for it anymore. That's $400. But what that program does 3 times a day, it connects by ODBC to the Access database, pulls all the records out, dumps them in a MySQL database. And why does it do that? Because we've got my own front end against that MySQL data, which allows for better searching and, in fact, much, much quicker searching than we can actually do in the legacy system. But the legacy system is so ingrained, it's not one we can replace. So I have to work around it. But Xojo makes that easy. Eventually it will die an ignominious death and disappear into the sunset. And in all honesty, from my point of view, the sooner that happens, the better. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I am sold on web. Everything you saw in the desktop application, and I haven't actually fired that up. I'll just fire it up very briefly. You can see it running in the background. I've got it set against a local database, assuming it'll work. Everything in there is going to be in the main web app. But what you can see here, there's a few records in there, demo records from this morning. If anybody's putting in new records today, they're not going to show up because ultimately I'm using a local database because I didn't think connection would be up to much, but actually I've been quite surprised. It works quite well. And as you can see, the records that are entered are all there, and the notes are unencrypted on this particular desktop because they provided the correct key. You can import them into the Access database, generate your reports. So if I click for an annual summary, for example, it doesn't take too long to generate. And then, oops, don't close it. Good job, I always save things on the desktop rather naughtily, so it's easy to find. And there we have it. Was there another question? Yeah. Am I using different instances of the CGI for different branches? No. When I moved from PHP to the CGI within Xojo, it made my life easier because I previously used to have a different script for each branch, and the PHP MySQL are just doing its own thing. Now it's just one instance. There's 43 branches, yeah? They don't all use it currently, but I have no issues with like latency or, system because the amount of data exchange is so tiny. I've got another application on the web which I use for managing choir music, for example, and that can get a bit laggy because it's just a huge amount of data. But no, just run one CGI, pass it their code along with their key, and if it's valid, they're in and they carry on. Any other questions? Then I think David.
Is there anything in the Web 2.0 stuff that you're excited about when they implementing this?
Oh yeah, I mean my design skills might improve. That's for starters. I mean, if I'm developing websites, I use Bootstrap and jQuery. I'm quite sort of home with that. So to bring that into Xojo will be brilliant. So yeah, Web 2 does excite me in that respect, although it does also mean I won't be able to use CGIs anymore. I'll have to use standalones. And I think there may be an issue currently with my provider about the provision of standalone apps as opposed to CGI, so I need to revisit that when the time comes. But ultimately, yeah, Web 2 is a massive step forward, not least of all for the data-aware list box control, for example, which will be a bonus even for this small app. Yes, sir. That's a very good question that I don't know the answer for. What are the practical differences between CGI and standalone?
One runs under a web server, the other one runs standalone. It is its own HTML environment. There's no web server required.
It's got its own web server built in effect, hasn't it? Yeah.
It is a service that's running under.
I mean, the advantage for CGI for me is that if I upload 4 or 5, as long as I name them all a different name, they go up and they run. With the standalones, you have to give them a port, that's my understanding, and then you have to direct them to the specific port for your particular app, which is quite good in some respects because you can only limit to certain ports and so on and so forth. I mean, I do use standalone apps. I've got a Windows server at home which runs that that I call it a console app, but in effect it's a web app that checks the availability of this application and then obviously sends me a text message if it's down. So I do use standalone apps on my own server, but my current provider, there seems to be an issue with providing standalone apps, and it's probably something I need to discuss with them. Clearly, if push comes to a shove, with the new changes to Xojo Cloud and so on and so forth, then moving to standalone apps will be perfect. Any other questions? Yes, sir. No, I appreciate that. It's always difficult. When I first started coming to Xojo, I have to say some of the sessions did sort of bypass me because my technical and skill levels weren't there. So I thought it'd be better to start at a lower level and maybe give something back. So thanks for that. Appreciate that. Nobody else? Excellent. Thanks for your time, and on to your next session. Thank you.